Sarah had always been a night owl, so when the position at Mercy General Hospital's night shift opened up, she jumped at the opportunity. As a registered nurse with 3 years of experience, she thought she'd seen everything the emergency room could throw at her. She was wrong. The hospital had a reputation among the staff. Whispered conversations in break rooms, nervous glances down empty corridors, and an unusually high turnover rate for night shift workers. But Sarah needed the job, and the differential pay was too good to pass up. Her first week went smoothly enough. The usual parade of late-night emergencies, bar fights, car accidents, overdoses, and the occasional heart attack. Dr. Morrison, the attending physician, was professional but distant. The other nurses, Janet and Mike, were friendly, but seemed to avoid certain topics whenever Sarah brought them up. It was during her second week that Sarah first noticed the patient in room 237. She was reviewing charts at the nurse's station when she glanced up and saw him, a tall, gaunt man in a hospital gown, standing perfectly still in the doorway of room 237. His skin had a waxy yellowish pallor, and his eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Excuse me," Sarah called out, standing from her chair. "Sir, you need to return to your bed." The man didn't respond. He just stood there, staring. Sarah walked toward him, her footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. As she got closer, she noticed something odd about his breathing, or rather, the lack of it. His chest wasn't rising or falling. "Sir," she said again, now only a few feet away. The man's head tilted slightly like a curious dog, and then he smiled. It was the most unsettling smile Sarah had ever seen, too wide, showing too many teeth, and his lips were blue-black as if he'd been dead for hours. Sarah blinked, and he was gone. She stood in the empty doorway of room 237, her heart pounding. The room was dark, the bed empty and unmade. She checked the chart. No patient had been assigned to that room in over a month. "You okay?" Janet's voice made her jump. Sarah turned to find the older nurse standing behind her, concern etched on her face. "I thought I saw... There was a patient here. A man in a hospital gown." Janet's expression darkened. What did he look like? Sarah described the man, watching as Janet's face grew paler with each detail. "Jesus," Janet whispered, "come on, let's get some coffee." In the break room, Janet poured 2 cups of coffee with shaking hands. "His name was Thomas Brennan," she said quietly. "He died in that room 3 months ago. Pancreatic cancer. He was difficult, angry, kept saying he wasn't ready to go, that he had unfinished business." "Janet, that's impossible. What I saw was Thomas Brennan." Janet's voice was firm. "You're not the first to see him. Hell, you won't be the last. He appears to new staff, usually within the first few weeks. It's like he's checking us out." Sarah stared at her colleague. "You're serious?" "Dead serious. No pun intended." Janet took a sip of her coffee. "Look, I've been working nights here for 15 years. I've seen things that would make your hair turn white. This place, it holds on to people. Some of them just don't want to leave." The rest of the shift passed without incident, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to move. Every reflection in the polished floors looked like it might hide something sinister. Over the following weeks, Sarah's encounters with Thomas Brennan became more frequent and more unsettling. She would see him standing at the end of long corridors, always in the same hospital gown, always with that terrible smile. Sometimes he would be sitting in the waiting room among the living patients, and she would only realize he was there when she noticed how the temperature dropped around him. The other staff had learned to live with him, but Sarah couldn't. She started drinking more coffee to stay alert, jumping at every sound, second-guessing every shadow. Her work began to suffer. Then came the night that changed everything. Sarah was checking on a patient in room 220 when she heard the code blue alarm, room 237. Her blood ran cold as she rushed toward the commotion, knowing somehow that this was different. Dr. Morrison was already there, along with Janet and Mike. They were working on a middle-aged woman who had been brought in with chest pains. But as Sarah approached, she saw him, Thomas Brennan, standing in the corner of the room, watching the resuscitation attempt with obvious satisfaction. "He's here," Sarah whispered to Janet. Janet followed her gaze and paled. "He's never been present during a code before." They worked frantically on the woman, but it was too late. Dr. Morrison called the time of death at 3:17 a.m. As the team stepped back, Sarah watched in horror as Thomas Brennan approached the woman's body. He leaned over her, and for a moment, his form seemed to flicker and fade. Then the woman's eyes snapped open. She sat up with a gasp, looking around the room wildly. "Where am I? What happened?" Dr. Morrison was stunned. That's impossible. She was dead. No pulse, no brain activity." But Sarah knew what had happened. She looked toward the corner where Thomas Brennan had been standing, but he was gone. The woman was alive, but something was wrong with her eyes. They held the same cold, calculating look that Sarah had seen in Brennan's gaze. Over the next few days, Sarah watched the woman, Mrs. Patterson, with growing dread. She was physically recovered, but her personality had changed completely. She was cold, cruel to the staff, and seemed to take pleasure in other patients' pain. And sometimes, when she thought no one was looking, Sarah caught her smiling that same terrible smile. The truth hit Sarah like a physical blow. Thomas Brennan hadn't moved on. He had found a way to stay. He was possessing the dying, taking their bodies when they were at their weakest, using them to continue his existence in the world of the living. And now Sarah understood why the night shift had such a high turnover rate. It wasn't just about seeing ghosts. It was about watching a monster collect bodies, one code blue at a time. The next night, Sarah came to work with a plan. She had researched Thomas Brennan's background and discovered something the hospital administration had tried to cover up. He had been a patient, yes, but before his illness, he had been a morgue attendant at the very same hospital. For 23 years, he had worked with the dead, and according to several reports that had been mysteriously buried, there had been irregularities, missing organs, bodies that had been tampered with, families who complained about the condition of their loved ones. Thomas Brennan had been a monster in life, and death had only made him worse. Sarah waited until the hospital was quiet, then made her way to the basement morgue. If her theory was correct, that's where she would find answers. The elevator descended with mechanical precision, and when the doors opened, she was greeted by the antiseptic smell of formaldehyde and death. The morgue was exactly as she had imagined: stainless steel tables, refrigerated drawers, and the constant hum of machinery. But there was something else, something that made her skin crawl. The temperature was wrong, too cold even for a morgue, and there was a presence here that felt ancient and malevolent. She found what she was looking for in the old records room, files that dated back to Brennan's employment. The reports were damning: bodies that had been mutilated, organs that had been removed and never accounted for, and a pattern of abuse that had gone on for years. But what caught her attention was a note in his personnel file about his unusual interest in the resurrection practices of ancient cultures. Thomas Brennan hadn't just been a ghoul, he had been a student of death, learning how to cheat it, how to manipulate it. And when his own time came, he had put that knowledge to use. Sarah heard footsteps in the corridor and quickly gathered the files. She had to get this information to someone who could help, someone who could stop Brennan before he claimed more victims. But as she turned to leave, she found herself face to face with Mrs. Patterson, or rather, the thing that was wearing Mrs. Patterson's body. Her eyes were completely black now, and when she smiled, Sarah could see that her teeth had become sharp and pointed. "You shouldn't have come here," Mrs. Patterson said in a voice that wasn't quite her own. "Thomas doesn't like people poking around in his business." Sarah tried to run, but Mrs. Patterson moved with inhuman speed, blocking her path. "He's been watching you, you know. He likes you. You're young, healthy, strong. You'd make a much better host than this old woman." The possessed woman lunged at Sarah, but Sarah was ready. She had brought something with her, a syringe filled with potassium chloride, enough to stop a heart. If Brennan was possessing the dying, then maybe forcing the host to die again would break his hold. Sarah jabbed the needle into Mrs. Patterson's neck and depressed the plunger. The woman screamed, a sound that was both human and something else entirely. Her body convulsed, and for a moment, Sarah could see two figures struggling within her, Mrs. Patterson's soul and Thomas Brennan's dark presence. Then Mrs. Patterson collapsed, and Sarah felt a cold wind rush past her. Thomas Brennan's form materialized in the morgue, but he was different now, more solid, more real, and infinitely more angry. "You meddling little bitch," he snarled, his voice like grinding bones. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Sarah backed away, but there was nowhere to go. Brennan advanced on her, his hospital gown billowing in a wind that shouldn't exist. "I've been trapped in this place for months," he continued, feeding on scraps, possessing the dying for just a few hours at a time. "But you're going to give me something permanent." Sarah felt a terrible cold seeping into her bones, and she realized that Brennan was trying to possess her while she was still alive. She could feel his presence pressing against her consciousness, trying to find a way in. But Sarah had one more trick up her sleeve. She had read about possession in her research, and she knew that it required the host to be weakened, vulnerable. She pulled out a second syringe, this one filled with epinephrine, a powerful stimulant that would make her body fight against any intrusion. She jabbed it into her thigh and felt her heart rate soar. The adrenaline coursed through her system, and suddenly Brennan's presence was pushed back. "No!" he screamed, his form beginning to flicker and fade. "You can't fight me forever!" Sarah ran. She ran through the morgue, into the elevator, and up to the main floor. Behind her, she could hear Thomas Brennan's rage echoing through the building, and she knew he would be coming for her. She burst into the nurse's station where Janet was sitting doing paperwork. "Janet, we have to get everyone out of here. Now!" Janet looked up, concerned. "Sarah, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I have, and it's not just seeing him anymore. He's possessing people, Janet. He's been taking over the bodies of patients who die, using them to stay in the world of the living." Janet stared at her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "I wondered why some of the families complained about personality changes in relatives who had been resuscitated, people who came back different. We have to stop him. I found his files. He was doing this even when he was alive, studying death, learning how to manipulate it. When he died, he just took it to the next level." The lights in the hospital began to flicker, and the temperature dropped noticeably. Sarah could hear the sound of medical equipment malfunctioning throughout the building. "He's angry," Janet whispered. "He's never been this active before." Sarah grabbed Janet's arm. "We need to get to the chapel. If there's any place in this hospital that might be safe from him, it's there." They ran through the corridors, past confused patients and staff who were wondering why all the equipment was going haywire. The hospital's public address system crackled to life, and Thomas Brennan's voice echoed through the building. "Sarah," he said, his voice distorted by static. "You can't hide from me. I know every corner of this place, every shadow. And when I find you, I'm going to make you pay for what you've done." Sarah and Janet reached the chapel just as the main power went out. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The chapel was small and simple, with wooden pews and a modest altar. But more importantly, it felt different, warmer, safer. "Will this actually work?" Janet asked, breathing heavily. "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "But it's the only place in the hospital that was built for the living, not the dying. Maybe that means something." They barricaded the door and waited. Outside, they could hear chaos, alarms going off, patients screaming, staff running through the corridors. Thomas Brennan was taking his rage out on the entire hospital. Then suddenly, everything went quiet. "Sarah," Brennan's voice came from just outside the chapel door. "I know you're in there. This is holy ground. I can't enter yet. But I'm patient. I've been dead for months. I can wait a little longer." Sarah closed her eyes and tried to think. There had to be a way to stop him permanently. She thought about the files she had read, about his obsession with resurrection practices. If he had learned how to cheat death, maybe there was a way to force him to face it properly. "Janet," she whispered, "do you know anything about the hospital's history? Was there ever a chaplain here? Someone who dealt with spiritual matters?" Janet nodded slowly. "Father McKenna. He was here for 30 years before he retired. He used to perform last rites, help families cope with loss. He might know something about this." "Can you call him?" "It's 3 a.m. "Janet, look around." "I don't think normal rules apply anymore." While Janet made the call, Sarah tried to keep Thomas Brennan talking. "Why are you doing this?" she called out. "You're dead. Why can't you just move on?" Brennan laughed, a sound like broken glass. "Move on to what? I spent my entire life surrounded by death, studying it, learning from it. When my time came, I realized that death is just another kind of life, one with different rules. I'm not going to give up my existence just because my body stopped working." "But you're taking other people's bodies, other people's lives. The dying don't need them anymore. I'm giving their shells purpose, meaning. I'm making them useful again." Sarah felt sick. She had been right. Thomas Brennan was a monster, and death had only made him worse. Janet finished her call and turned to Sarah. "Father McKenna is on his way. He said to tell you that the chapel has been consecrated, blessed ground. As long as we stay here, we should be safe." They waited in tense silence for what felt like hours. Outside, the hospital had gone quiet again, but Sarah knew that Thomas Brennan was still out there, waiting for them to make a mistake. Finally, they heard a knock at the chapel door. "Sarah?" "Janet, it's Father McKenna." Sarah carefully opened the door to find an elderly priest standing in the hallway. He was tall and thin, with white hair and kind eyes, but there was something about him that suggested he had seen more than his share of darkness. "Father, thank God you're here," Janet said. Father McKenna stepped into the chapel and immediately began pulling items from a bag he carried. "I've been expecting this for a long time," he said quietly. "Thomas Brennan was evil in life, and I knew he wouldn't rest easy in death." "You knew about him?" Sarah asked. "I performed his last rites," Father McKenna replied, setting up what looked like the preparations for an exorcism. "Or rather, I tried to. He refused them, said he didn't need God's help where he was going. I had a feeling he meant it literally." The priest began to chant in Latin, and Sarah felt the air in the chapel grow warmer. Outside, they could hear Thomas Brennan screaming in rage. "What are you doing?" Sarah asked. "I'm consecrating not just this chapel, but the entire hospital," Father McKenna explained, "making it truly holy ground. If Brennan is tied to this place, then blessing it completely should force him to face his judgment." The chanting grew louder, and the screaming outside became more intense. Sarah could hear the sound of breaking glass and crumbling concrete as Thomas Brennan's rage reached its peak. Then suddenly, everything went quiet. Father McKenna finished his chanting and looked up. "It's done. Thomas Brennan has been sent to face his judgment. He can't hide from death anymore." Sarah and Janet looked at each other, hardly daring to believe it could be over. "Is he gone?" Janet asked. "Yes," Father McKenna said simply. "He's gone." The next morning, Sarah returned to work to find the hospital back to normal. The equipment was functioning, the patients were calm, and there was no sign of Thomas Brennan anywhere. Even room 237 felt different, lighter somehow. But Sarah knew she would never forget what she had learned during those terrible nights. Death was not always the end, and some monsters were too evil to rest peacefully. The night shift at Mercy General would never be the same for her, but at least now she knew that sometimes, with enough courage and the right help, even the dead could be forced to face justice. As she began her rounds, Sarah noticed that the other staff members seemed different too, more relaxed, as if a weight had been lifted from their shoulders. Word had spread quickly about what had happened, and while not everyone believed the full story, they all agreed that something had changed for the better. The hospital's night shift would continue, but Thomas Brennan would not be part of it. He had finally been forced to move on, to face whatever judgment awaited him in the afterlife. And Sarah, having survived her encounter with a monster that refused to die, knew that she was stronger than she had ever imagined. Marcus had always been fascinated by antiques. There was something about owning a piece of history, something that had been touched by hands long dead, that appealed to his sense of connection with the past. So when he inherited his great-uncle's house, along with all its contents, he felt like he had won the lottery. The house itself was impressive, a Victorian mansion that had been in the family for over a century. But it was the collection inside that truly took Marcus's breath away. His great-uncle Harold had been a collector of the highest order. Rare books, antique furniture, vintage photographs, and curiosities from around the world filled every room. Marcus took a leave of absence from his job as a software engineer to catalog and appraise the collection. He moved into the house temporarily, planning to spend a few months organizing everything before deciding what to keep and what to sell. The first few days were like Christmas morning. Every room held new treasures: a first edition Dickens novel, a Civil War era medical kit, a collection of Victorian mourning jewelry, and countless other items that would fetch impressive prices at auction. It was while exploring the basement that Marcus found the most intriguing items. Hidden behind a false wall, he discovered a room that his great-uncle had never mentioned, a room filled with the most unusual collection he had ever seen. The room was lined with glass display cases, each containing what appeared to be personal items: a child's doll, a wedding ring, a pocket watch, a hairbrush, a fountain pen. But there was something unsettling about the collection. Each item was accompanied by a small placard with a name, date, and brief description. Emily Richardson, age 7, died of scarlet fever, 1923. Favorite doll. Jonathan Hayes, age 34, died in industrial accident, 1945. Wedding ring. Margaret Whitmore, age 67, died of natural causes, 1956. Hairbrush used daily for 40 years. Marcus realized with growing unease that these weren't just antiques, they were personal possessions of the dead. His great-uncle had been collecting items from deceased individuals, probably purchasing them from estate sales or grieving families. While morbid, it wasn't necessarily sinister. Many collectors specialized in post-mortem photography, mourning jewelry, and other death-related artifacts. But as Marcus continued to examine the collection, he noticed something disturbing. The dates were all wrong. According to the placards, some of these people had died decades ago, but the items looked far too well preserved, almost as if they had been kept in perfect condition through supernatural means. Marcus picked up the child's doll, Emily Richardson's doll. The moment his fingers touched the fabric, he felt a chill run through his body. For just a moment, he could have sworn he heard the sound of a child crying, very faintly, as if from a great distance. He quickly put the doll back and stepped away from the display case. He was letting his imagination run wild. There was nothing supernatural about old objects. They were just well preserved by his great-uncle's careful storage methods. But that night, Marcus had trouble sleeping. He kept thinking about the hidden room and its contents. More specifically, he kept thinking about that doll and the sound of crying he thought he had heard. Around midnight, he was jolted awake by a sound from downstairs. It was faint, but unmistakable. A child crying. Marcus got out of bed and crept to the top of the stairs, listening intently. The crying was coming from the direction of the basement. Marcus grabbed a flashlight and slowly made his way downstairs. The crying grew louder as he approached the basement door. His hand trembled as he turned the knob and descended the stairs. The hidden room was exactly as he had left it, but the crying was definitely coming from inside. Marcus approached Emily Richardson's display case and found the doll sitting in a different position than before. Its head was turned toward the glass, and its painted eyes seemed to be looking directly at him. The crying stopped abruptly. Marcus stared at the doll for a long moment, trying to convince himself that he had imagined everything. Dolls didn't move on their own. Dead children didn't cry through their toys. He was just stressed from the move and the overwhelming task of cataloging his great-uncle's collection. But as he turned to leave, he heard a small voice whisper, "Please don't go." Marcus spun around, but the room was empty except for the display cases and their contents. The doll was back in its original position, staring straight ahead with lifeless eyes. Marcus ran upstairs and locked the basement door behind him. He spent the rest of the night in the living room, trying to convince himself that stress and imagination were playing tricks on him. The next morning, he decided to research his great-uncle's collection more thoroughly. He found Harold's journals in the study, detailed records of every acquisition, including when and where each item had been obtained. What he discovered chilled him to the bone. Harold hadn't been buying these items from estate sales or antique dealers. According to his journals, he had been taking them from the recently deceased. The entries described visits to funeral homes, hospitals, and even private homes where he would somehow acquire personal items from people who had just died. But the most disturbing entries were the recent ones. Harold had been collecting items from people who had died within the past few years, not decades ago, as Marcus had initially thought. The dates on the placards were accurate. These people had died recently, and somehow Harold had obtained their most precious possessions. Marcus found a newspaper clipping from just 6 months ago. Local man dies in car accident. The victim was Jonathan Hayes, age 34. According to Harold's journal, he had visited the funeral home the night before the burial and somehow acquired Hayes's wedding ring. Marcus felt sick. His great-uncle had been desecrating the dead, stealing from grieving families, violating the sacred boundary between life and death. But why? What had driven him to create this macabre collection? He found his answer in Harold's final journal entry, dated just 1 week before his death. The collection is nearly complete. 47 souls, each bound to their most cherished possession. I can feel their presence growing stronger each day. Soon, I will have enough spiritual energy to complete the ritual. Death will no longer be an ending, but a transformation. I will become the keeper of souls, the bridge between the living and the dead. Immortality is within my grasp. Marcus dropped the journal, his hands shaking. His great-uncle hadn't just been collecting items, he had been collecting souls. Somehow he had discovered a way to bind the spirits of the dead to their personal possessions, trapping them in a kind of spiritual prison. And now Marcus was living in a house filled with trapped souls. As if responding to his realization, the house began to react. The temperature dropped noticeably, and Marcus could hear sounds from all over the mansion. Footsteps in empty rooms, voices whispering in the walls, doors opening and closing on their own. Marcus ran to the basement, hoping to find some way to release the trapped spirits. But when he opened the door to the hidden room, he found that it had changed. The display cases were open, and the items were floating in the air, glowing with an eerie light. And standing in the center of the room was his great-uncle Harold. Harold looked exactly as Marcus remembered him, but there was something different about his eyes. They were completely black, like pools of ink. When he spoke, his voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Marcus, my boy, I was wondering when you would find my collection." "Uncle Harold? But you're dead." Harold smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Dead? No, not dead. Transformed. I have become something more than human, something that exists between life and death. And you, my dear nephew, are going to help me complete my work." Marcus tried to back away, but found that his feet wouldn't move. He was frozen in place, held by some invisible force. "You see," Harold continued, "I have learned to harvest the spiritual energy of the deceased. Each soul I collect makes me stronger, more powerful, but I need someone living to help me gather more souls. Someone who can move freely in the world of the living." "I won't help you," Marcus said, struggling against the invisible bonds that held him. "Oh, but you will, because if you don't, I will release all 47 souls at once, and they will tear you apart. They are quite angry about being trapped here, you know. They would love to have someone to blame for their predicament." As if to emphasize his point, the floating objects began to move more violently. Marcus could hear the voices of the trapped souls, angry, desperate, pleading for release. "What do you want me to do?" Marcus asked, knowing he had no choice. "Simple. Continue my work. Visit the recently deceased, acquire their most precious possessions, and bring them back here. I will handle the spiritual binding. Together, we will build an army of souls that will give me power beyond imagination. Marcus felt sick, but he knew that he had to play along until he could find a way to stop his great uncle and free the trapped souls. "How do I know which items to take?" he asked. Harold gestured to one of the display cases, and a new placard appeared. Marcus Thompson, age 29, died of curiosity. 2025. Soul to be harvested. Marcus realized with horror that Harold was planning to add him to the collection eventually. He was just a tool to be used until he was no longer needed. "I understand," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice steady. "When do we start?" "Tonight. There was a car accident yesterday. A young woman named Lisa Chen died on impact. Her funeral is tomorrow. You will visit the funeral home tonight and acquire something personal. Jewelry, a keepsake, anything that held special meaning for her." Harold waved his hand, and Marcus felt the invisible bonds release him. "Don't try to run, my boy. The house is warded against escape. You belong to me now, just as surely as these souls belong to me." Marcus nodded and left the basement, his mind racing. He had to find a way to stop Harold and free the trapped souls, but he was dealing with forces beyond his understanding. He needed help, but who would believe his story? As he walked through the house, Marcus could feel the presence of the trapped souls. They were all around him, watching, waiting. Some seemed hostile, angry at anyone associated with Harold. Others seemed desperate, pleading for help. Marcus sat in the study and tried to think. There had to be a way to break the spiritual bonds that held the souls prisoner. Harold had mentioned a ritual in his journal. Perhaps if Marcus could find the details, he could reverse it. He searched through Harold's books and papers, looking for any information about soul binding or spiritual imprisonment. Most of it was written in languages he didn't recognize, but eventually he found what he was looking for: a detailed description of the ritual Harold had used to trap the souls. According to the text, the souls were bound to their possessions through a combination of necromantic magic and emotional attachment. The stronger the emotional connection between the person and the object, the more powerful the binding. But the ritual had a weakness. It required the willing participation of the deceased. Harold had been tricking the souls into binding themselves by convincing them that their loved ones needed them to stay. More importantly, the binding could be broken if the souls were given a choice to leave freely. The problem was that Harold's presence was preventing them from making that choice. As long as he existed in his transformed state, the souls would remain trapped. Marcus realized what he had to do. He had to destroy Harold's transformed form and give the souls a chance to choose their own fate. But how could he fight something that was no longer entirely human? The answer came to him as he remembered something from Harold's journal. The transformation had been powered by the spiritual energy of the trapped souls. If Marcus could somehow disrupt that energy, Harold would lose his power and presumably return to being truly dead. Marcus spent the rest of the day preparing. He gathered supplies from around the house: candles, salt, iron objects, and anything else that might be useful in a spiritual confrontation. He also found something interesting in Harold's desk: a small silver pendant that seemed to repel the spiritual energy in the house. When Marcus wore it, he felt stronger, more protected. That evening, Harold appeared in the study. "It's time, Marcus. The funeral home is closed and the security is minimal. You should have no trouble acquiring what we need." Marcus nodded and followed Harold to the front door. But instead of leaving, he turned and ran toward the basement. He had to try to free the souls before Harold could stop him. "Marcus!" Harold roared, his voice shaking the entire house. "You cannot escape me." Marcus reached the hidden room and found the soul's possessions still floating in the air, glowing with trapped spiritual energy. He grabbed the silver pendant around his neck and felt its power flow through him. "Listen to me," he shouted to the trapped souls. "You don't have to stay here. You can choose to leave. Your loved ones don't need you to suffer like this." The floating objects began to move more violently, and Marcus could hear the voices of the souls, some angry, some confused, some hopeful. Harold appeared in the doorway, his black eyes blazing with fury. "You stupid boy! You have no idea what you're doing." "I know exactly what I'm doing," Marcus replied, holding up the silver pendant. "I'm giving them a choice." Harold lunged at him, but the pendant's power created a barrier between them. "You cannot protect them from me. I am their master now." "No," said a voice from behind Harold. "You are nothing." Marcus turned to see the spirits of the trapped souls materializing in the room. They were translucent, but clearly visible. Men, women, and children of all ages, all staring at Harold with expressions of righteous anger. "You lied to us," said the spirit of Emily Richardson, the little girl whose doll had been the first item Marcus had touched. "You told us our families needed us to stay, but they don't. They need us to be at peace." "You have no right to keep us here," added Jonathan Hayes, the man whose wedding ring Harold had stolen. "We choose to leave." Harold screamed as the spiritual energy that had been sustaining him began to dissipate. The trapped souls were breaking free, and without their power, he was losing his grip on his transformed existence. "You cannot leave me!" Harold shouted. "I am your collector. I am your keeper." "You are nothing," Emily Richardson repeated. "And now you will face the judgment you tried to avoid." One by one, the souls began to fade away, finally free to move on to whatever awaited them in the afterlife. As they left, Harold's form became less solid, more transparent. "This isn't over," Harold said, his voice growing weaker. "I will find a way to return. I will rebuild my collection." "No," Marcus said firmly. "You won't." He grabbed one of the iron objects he had prepared, a heavy poker from the fireplace, and struck Harold's form. The silver pendant amplified the blow, and Harold's spirit shattered like glass. The house shuddered, and Marcus felt the oppressive spiritual energy that had filled it begin to dissipate. The floating objects fell to the floor, no longer animated by trapped souls. The display cases went dark, and the hidden room returned to being just another basement storage area. Marcus stood alone among the scattered possessions, breathing heavily. It was over. Harold was gone, and the souls were free. But as he turned to leave, Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. In the corner of the room, where Harold had been standing when he was destroyed, a small puddle of black liquid was seeping into the floor, and carved into the concrete beneath it were symbols that seemed to pulse with their own dark light. Harold had been destroyed, but something of him remained. The ritual he had used to transform himself had left a mark on the house itself, a spiritual stain that would be difficult to remove. Marcus realized that his work wasn't finished. The house itself had been corrupted by Harold's dark rituals, and as long as those symbols remained, there was a chance that Harold, or something worse, could return. Over the following weeks, Marcus researched methods of spiritual cleansing and purification. He contacted priests, occultists, and anyone else who might have knowledge of how to remove the supernatural stain from the house. Finally, he found a solution in one of Harold's own books, a purification ritual that would cleanse the house completely, but at a cost. The ritual required the voluntary sacrifice of someone with a blood connection to the person who had corrupted the space. Marcus was Harold's great-nephew, and his blood carried the same spiritual signature that Harold had used to bind the souls. By offering his life force to cleanse the house, Marcus could ensure that Harold's evil would never return. Marcus spent his final night in the house writing letters to his family and friends, explaining what had happened and why he had to make this choice. He couldn't let Harold's evil spread beyond the house, couldn't risk other innocent people being trapped like the 47 souls he had helped free. At dawn, Marcus performed the purification ritual. As his life force flowed into the house, he felt the spiritual corruption being burned away. The symbols in the basement cracked and crumbled, and the oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the mansion for so long finally lifted. Marcus collapsed as the ritual completed, but he was smiling. He had done it. Harold's evil was gone, and the house was finally clean. As his vision faded, he thought he saw the spirits of the freed souls standing around him, nodding in approval before fading away into the light. The house was found empty a week later when Marcus's family came to check on him. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of what had happened. Marcus had simply disappeared, leaving behind only a note explaining that he had found peace and asking that the house be sold and the proceeds donated to charity. The mansion was eventually demolished, and a children's playground was built on the site. Local residents sometimes report seeing the spirits of children playing there at dusk, but they're not frightening presences. They're joyful, free, at peace at last. And sometimes, visitors claim to see a young man watching over the playground, making sure that the children are safe and happy. They say he has kind eyes and a gentle smile, and that he never lets any harm come to the innocent. Marcus had made the ultimate sacrifice to ensure that Harold's evil would never return, but in doing so, he had found his own form of immortality, not as a collector of souls, but as their protector. Dr. Elena Vasquez had always been fascinated by the possibility of extraterrestrial life. As a radio astronomer at the Arecibo Observatory, she spent her days listening to the cosmos, searching for patterns in the static that might indicate intelligent life beyond Earth. Most of her colleagues had given up on SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, considering it a waste of time and resources. But Elena remained optimistic. The universe was vast, and the possibility that Earth was the only planet harboring intelligent life seemed statistically impossible. So when she detected an unusual signal during a routine observation session, her heart began to race with excitement. The signal was unlike anything in the database. It wasn't a pulsar, wasn't cosmic background radiation, and wasn't any known astronomical phenomenon. It was clearly artificial, a series of mathematical progressions that repeated every 23 minutes and 14 seconds. Elena spent the next 3 days analyzing the signal, barely sleeping or eating. The pattern was incredibly complex, far beyond anything humans had created. It seemed to be a form of communication, but the mathematical structure was so advanced that Elena could only understand fragments of it. What she could understand was troubling. The signal appeared to be a warning. Embedded within the mathematical sequences were what seemed to be star charts showing the locations of solar systems that had been destroyed, consumed, turned into dead zones where no life could exist. Elena tried to convince herself that she was misinterpreting the data. Perhaps the signal was natural after all, just a cosmic phenomenon that she didn't recognize. But the mathematical precision was undeniable. This was a message from an intelligent source. And according to the star charts, the destruction was moving in a pattern, a slow, methodical consumption of life-bearing worlds that was heading directly toward Earth's sector of the galaxy. Elena brought her findings to her supervisor, Dr. Marcus Chen, but he was skeptical. "Elena, you've been working too many hours," he said, reviewing her data. "You're seeing patterns that aren't there. This is just background noise, maybe interference from a satellite." "Marcus, look at the mathematical structure. No satellite creates patterns like this. This is a deliberate communication." Dr. Chen sighed. "Even if it is, which I doubt, what do you expect us to do about it? If there's some kind of threat coming from space, it's beyond our ability to address." Elena left the meeting frustrated but determined. She continued monitoring the signal, and what she discovered over the following weeks made her blood run cold. The signal was getting stronger. Whatever was sending it was getting closer. Moreover, the mathematical progressions were becoming more complex, more detailed. Elena began to realize that she wasn't just receiving a warning, she was receiving instructions. The source of the signal was trying to teach her something, to prepare her for what was coming. Elena worked in secret, afraid that if she shared her discoveries, the government would shut down her research or classify it beyond her reach. She developed new algorithms to decode the signal, and slowly, a horrifying picture began to emerge. The signal was being sent by the survivors of a species that had encountered something they called the Silence. It was a form of life so alien, so incomprehensible that it existed in the spaces between matter, in the quantum foam that underlies reality itself. The Silence didn't destroy worlds in the conventional sense. Instead, it absorbed them, converting their matter and energy into something else, a gray, lifeless substance that existed in a state between existence and non-existence. Worlds touched by the Silence became voids in space, areas where the laws of physics simply stopped working. According to the signal, the Silence had been moving through the galaxy for millions of years, leaving a trail of dead systems in its wake. The species sending the warning had managed to escape their homeworld before the Silence arrived, but they had been too late to save their civilization. Elena realized that the signal wasn't just a warning, it was a test. The surviving aliens were determining whether humanity was intelligent enough to understand the threat and prepare for it. But prepare how? What could humanity possibly do against something that existed beyond the normal laws of physics? The answer came in the final part of the signal that Elena decoded. The aliens had discovered that the Silence could be fought, but only by species that understood the true nature of consciousness and reality. The battle against the Silence wasn't physical, it was metaphysical, a war fought in the realm of pure thought and will. Elena began to understand that consciousness itself was a form of energy, a force that could reshape reality at the quantum level. The aliens were trying to teach humanity how to weaponize consciousness, how to create a psychic defense against the Silence. But there was a catch. The process required the willing sacrifice of a significant portion of humanity's population. Their consciousness would have to be linked together and focused into a single powerful mind capable of standing against the Silence. Those who participated in the linking would survive, but their individual identities would be lost, absorbed into the collective consciousness. Elena spent sleepless nights wrestling with the implications. She was being asked to help orchestrate the end of human individuality in order to save the species. Was survival worth such a price? Her decision was made for her when she detected a new signal, this one coming from within the solar system. The Silence had arrived. Elena watched in horror as the outer planets began to change. Neptune's blue atmosphere turned gray, and the planet's gravitational field started to fluctuate wildly. Uranus simply stopped. Its rotation ceased. Its magnetic field vanished, and the planet became a dead sphere of matter that didn't reflect light properly. Elena knew she had to act. She sent out a global alert, transmitting the aliens' instructions to every radio telescope, every research institution, every government agency she could reach. Most dismissed her as a crank, but a few scientists took her seriously enough to investigate. Dr. Sarah Kim at the Tokyo Observatory confirmed Elena's readings. Dr. James Morrison at the Very Large Array validated her mathematical analysis. Within 48 hours, a small group of the world's leading astronomers and physicists had accepted the reality of the threat. They called themselves the Consciousness Project, and they began working frantically to implement the aliens' instructions. The process was incredibly complex, requiring the construction of a global network of psychic amplifiers and the recruitment of millions of volunteers willing to link their minds together. Elena became the reluctant leader of the project, the one person who fully understood the alien instructions. She coordinated the construction of the amplifiers, trained the volunteers in the meditation techniques required for consciousness linking, and prepared humanity for its final transformation. As the silence moved through the solar system, consuming Jupiter and Mars with terrifying efficiency, Elena realized that they were running out of time. The amplifier network was only 60% complete, and they had nowhere near enough volunteers to create a consciousness powerful enough to fight the silence. Elena made a difficult decision. She would have to initiate the linking process with whoever was available and hope that their combined consciousness would be sufficient. The alternative was the complete annihilation of humanity. On the night before the silence reached Earth, Elena activated the amplifier network. Around the world, millions of people who had volunteered for the project felt their individual consciousness begin to merge with something larger. Elena felt her own sense of self dissolving as she became part of a vast collective mind. The experience was both terrifying and exhilarating. Elena could feel the thoughts and emotions of everyone in the network, could access their memories and knowledge as if they were her own. But she was also losing herself, becoming just one voice in a chorus of millions. The collective consciousness that emerged from the linking was unlike anything humanity had ever experienced. It was a mind capable of perceiving reality at the quantum level, of understanding the true nature of existence, of manipulating the fabric of space-time itself. When the silence reached Earth, it encountered not a planet full of individual minds, but a single, unified consciousness that was ready to fight. The battle was beyond human comprehension. It took place in dimensions that normal matter couldn't access, in the spaces between thoughts and dreams. The collective human consciousness met the silence in a realm of pure concept and will, where the only weapons were understanding and determination. Elena, now part of the collective, felt the alien presence of the silence pressing against their defenses. It was vast, ancient, and utterly alien, a form of existence that negated everything humanity understood about life and consciousness. But the collective human mind had something that the silence didn't understand: creativity. Where the silence was static and unchanging, humanity was dynamic and adaptable. The collective consciousness began to evolve during the battle, creating new forms of thought and perception that the silence couldn't counter. The battle lasted for what felt like eternity, but was actually only minutes in normal time. In the end, the collective human consciousness succeeded in driving the silence away, forcing it to retreat to the spaces between galaxies where it could no longer threaten evolved life. But the victory came at a cost. The consciousness linking process was irreversible. The millions of people who had participated in the project could never return to their individual existences. They had become something new, a collective mind that transcended human limitations but had lost human individuality. Elena found herself in a strange existence, simultaneously herself and not herself. She retained her memories and personality, but she was now part of something larger. She could communicate with the other members of the collective, could access their knowledge and experience, but she could never again be alone with her own thoughts. The rest of humanity, those who hadn't participated in the linking, were safe but changed. They had witnessed the transformation of their species, had seen what it meant to sacrifice individuality for survival. Some were grateful, others were horrified, but all understood that humanity had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The collective consciousness became the guardians of Earth, watching for new threats from space and protecting the remaining individual humans. They established contact with other species in the galaxy, joining a community of civilizations that had faced similar challenges and made similar sacrifices. Elena, as part of the collective, continued her work as an astronomer, but now she had access to knowledge and perception beyond anything she had imagined. She could perceive the quantum structure of reality, could communicate with alien intelligences, could see the future patterns of cosmic evolution. But late at night, when the collective mind was at rest, Elena sometimes mourned for what humanity had lost. The ability to be alone with one's thoughts, to experience the full range of individual emotion, to make choices based on personal desire rather than collective need. These were prices that perhaps no victory was worth. Yet when she sensed the silence stirring in the dark spaces between galaxies, when she felt its hunger for the destruction of consciousness itself, Elena knew that the sacrifice had been necessary. Humanity had survived, had become something greater than they were before, and had taken their place among the cosmic community of evolved consciousness. The signal that had started it all continued to broadcast, but now it carried a different message. Instead of a warning about the silence, it was an invitation to other species who might be facing the same choice. Humanity had learned to fight the darkness between the stars, and they were willing to teach others how to do the same. Elena sometimes wondered if there had been another way, if humanity could have survived without sacrificing their individuality. But as she felt the warm presence of millions of minds linked with her own, as she experienced the vast love and understanding that flowed between the members of the collective, she realized that perhaps they had gained more than they had lost. The universe was vast and full of wonders, but it was also full of dangers that could only be faced by minds working in perfect harmony. Humanity had learned to transcend their limitations, to become something new and powerful and strange. And in the depths of space, other species were beginning to receive the signal that Elena and the collective consciousness were now sending, a message of hope, of transformation, and of the courage required to face the darkness between the stars. The age of individual human consciousness was over, but the age of collective human transcendence had just begun.